Hi everybody, it's Wade, VK1 MIC, and tonight I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction presentation on AREDN, which is the Amateur Radio Emergency Data Network. And I hope you enjoy it. It's something a bit different for amateurs. Quite often we're dealing with UHF and VHF. This is a bit higher up in the spectrum. So I hope you enjoy it, and I'll be available on the 2 meter Giannini repeater after the broadcast this evening to answer any questions. Otherwise, at the end of the presentation there are some email addresses if you'd like to send in any further questions. So without further ado, let's kick on. So as I said, I'm going to be covering off on AREDN, but I wanted to particularly have a look at it from a VK perspective because there are some differences and there are some pitfalls that we might want to keep in mind. So as I said, let's kick off. Let's see how it all goes. So some of the things I'm going to cover tonight are what is AREDN, what's a mesh network, and what can you do with it, who can use it, what bands it operates on, why you would use it, where you could use it, and again I'll come back to those Australian considerations. And while there's a lot of content coming out of the US where this network predominantly is in use, there are some local contexts and some local gotchas or licensing issues that we need to be aware of. So what is it? Mesh networking. So I'll show a picture in a second that explains mesh networking a bit more clearly. But essentially, instead of your network at home, which has your router or your wireless access point talking out to each device and back again, it's all the devices of the network can see and talk to each other, and they determine what is the fastest and best route for that data to travel. And when I say self-healing, if you take out one of those nodes, it continues as long as there's an RF or an IP connection, which we'll cover a little bit later. And AREDN is running on prosumer, so somewhere between normal consumer, mum and dad type hardware, and the commercial grade, so somewhere in the middle, Wi-Fi gear, or point-to-point and point-to-multipoint Wi-Fi gear, running custom firmware. The AREDN designers, they're an open source group of volunteers. They've written firmware for a number of hardware sets, and I'll show some of the pictures later. But when you see and when you go on the website and have a look at the supported hardware, there are quite a lot of devices. So AREDN, you don't actually need a computer if you just wanted to act as a relay point or a node in the mesh, if you were. You only need to add power, and all of the devices I've seen operate what is called power over Ethernet. So it's probably a bit outside the scope for tonight's presentation, but out of an Ethernet cable, data is only transferred on a number of those wires, and there's a networking standard that allows you to shoot power over some of the unused one. It's called power over Ethernet, or PoE. So you can just plug this into a power injector, strap this on your roof, or strap it on a mobile setup, as you'll see a little bit later, and you can act as a node. You can be a relay point. There's a low bar to entry to AREDN. Unfortunately for the foundation license holders, largely all of the things we'll be talking about tonight are covered by standard and advanced Australian licenses. The units start at about $100, and I haven't seen too many other than the ultimate top of the range stuff going over about $250 per node. And that's pretty unusual in amateur radio. Of course, you know, that low end there is only 3 Baofangs if you wanted to use that as a unit of measurement. So going back to before I said what is the mesh, what is a mesh, and how does it differ from your home network. So on the left there you'll see what is typically a large home or small business network there. You've got the internet coming in, going through a gateway, through a switch, which then pushes all the traffic out to access points and to individual devices. Excuse me. But on the right, you'll see the mesh. It's fundamentally different. The nodes are talking to each other and determining the best route for the traffic. So I don't want to dive too much in it tonight, but other than if you think about the nodes talking to each other and analysing which is the best route, if you take one of the nodes out, the mesh self-heals, or if there is a, when I say self-heals, I mean it determines if there is, the ability to continue using that as a pathway without that node, which I think is very, very interesting. So what can you do with it is always, why am I interested? What can you do with it? So I'll cover a little bit later, but you can operate both fixed or portable, and you'll see some pictures of some testing myself and Matt 1MA did very recently of some portable testing. Now, data on HF is about 300 baud. That's emails and APRS on HF radio. On VHF, you don't see much outside the 1200 and 9600 baud packet work. So when we're talking between 10 and 100 megabits of data speed across line of sight, which, hilltop to hilltop, region to region, device to device, is quite achievable. There's some very fast speeds in the amateur world. Excuse me. Some of the other things that the data or the traffic that you can push over AREDN are voice, so voice over internet protocol, which is phone calls, without going into the wider Telstra, Optus or other network type routing. Voice conferencing, video conferencing, streaming of IP cameras, and we might talk about that a little bit later about what that could possibly mean for us in VK1. And there is the ability to bridge normal internet into areas where that would normally not be accessible. And we might talk about that a little bit later as well. There's some pitfalls around that. But basically, if it can operate on IP, AREDN can carry it, subject to license conditions. So encryption, you have to have a bit of a think about that as well. So who can use it, or what bands is it on? Now, it's a bit different in Australia. That's why there's a lot of asterisks on your screen right now. But just to cover off, the AREDN firmware is written to cover 900 megahertz, 2.4 gigahertz, 3 gigahertz, and 5.8 gigahertz. Okay, so that's 2.4 and 5.8 is the Wi-Fi bands, but amateurs in Australia also have some allocations around there. I'm not planning to cover 900 in this presentation. Perhaps that could be covered by the ISM band in Australia. I have not looked into that, and I don't want to lead you down a garden path there. 2.4. Yeah, we have some band there around outside of the Wi-Fi band. The 2.4 band for Wi-Fi is very busy. So AREDN uses amateur-only frequencies very close to Wi-Fi. So where the Wi-Fi band is, AREDN will sit either just at the start or the end or both, and a couple of Wi-Fi channels wide, and we'll come to that a little bit later. So you can think about all of your noisy iPhones and Android phones, home networks, etc. existing in the Wi-Fi band, and then you've got AREDN just outside it where it's much quieter, none of this trash RF interfering. So the 2.4, there's some considerations there in Australia due to the Australian band plan not aligning with the predetermined and locked channels by the AREDN firmware. aligning, and that's a misalignment between the Australian band and the US band of 2.4 amateur. I've made the personal determination that 2.4 is largely unsuitable for Australia, and I'll show you the band plan and a bit of that later. 3 gigahertz. There's not much hardware around for 3 gigahertz. It would provide great long-range backhaul. When I say long-range, potentially up to 100 kilometers if you've got some summits where repeaters are talking to each other. But limited hardware, and it's limited to only advanced license holders only. Again, wait till the VK section of this presentation because there's some big questions around that. And 5.8 opens up a lot more for standard and advanced license holders to operate on, and we'll get onto that very, very shortly. So who can use it? One of the major differences between the Australian setup and the US model is licensing and band issues. Due to the Australian band plan not aligning with the locked channels that AREDN use, I won't show the software tonight, but AREDN basically has a drop-down box of which channel do you want to use, the normal Wi-Fi channels, and there's some either side which are called AREDN only channels. As I said, 2.4 is largely unsuitable based on that. When I show you the band plan, you'll see why. And on my personal reading, 5.8 would probably give us a better go in the Australian context. I've written a bit of a standards document that we can look at here in the ACT if we wanted to kick off an AREDN RF network. And why that's important: stations that want to connect by RF need to be on the same channel and the same bandwidth. That's how you get the connection. So in my planning, I've identified channel 168, which that's outside the Wi-Fi channels, which works out as a center frequency of 5.840 gig, 20 megahertz wide, and this obviously can be expanded, say, and for example, if there was a Tuggeranong cluster, they could be on 168, Belconnen could be on 170, and they could have an RF backhaul link between the two on a completely separate frequency there. That would allow that connection, and that would connect those two clusters. So all of Belconnen would be on one, all of Tuggeranong would be on another, and then you could link them by RF. Or if there's only a few of us playing, why wouldn't you stick on one and become part of the wider mesh there that allows people to come in and drop off as the time as our lives change. So I talked about prosumer before. What does that look like? So these are some of the devices. I own three of them that are on screen right now. The one on the far left, which is a Ubiquiti Nano station, that set me back about $120. That's a 5.8 device, 5.8 gig device. And the one beside that which is a GLINet 750. It's a travel router. I own two. One I keep as a travel router. The other I have put the AREDN software on, and it acts as a micro switch for me, as well as a Wi-Fi access point into the AREDN network. I'm probably using some terms and some concepts that are pushing the boundary of introduction to AREDN, so I'll leave that there. And then you can see that big mama next to it, the TP-Link. Interestingly, that's a 23 dBi dish, I believe. That only cost $100 in Australia. That's a TP-Link 610, CPE 610, I believe it's called. Anyway, before you buy anything, always check the supported matrix that's on the AREDN website. But the first and the third item that I mentioned there, they can actually create a RF link on 5.8 gigahertz, and cross manufacturer, all that kind of stuff, because they operate on the same mode, same band, and same frequency. Now, the other thing I put up there was the Microtech, which is the flat panel there. That's a 16 dBi dish, or panel, I guess you'd call it. And that's also you could pop that on your roof, pop that on your tower, and point around. Interestingly, the Ubiquity, which is the first one on the far left there, that's got about a 50-degree beam. So that might be great for a wide area coverage, but obviously that beam intensity dissipates over the 50 degrees. And the TP-Link, I think, has a 7-degree beam, so that's much narrower. That's where it's focusing all that energy, and that's obviously really great for a defined point to point, and that's pretty cool. Matt and I own a couple of each of those actually that we've been playing with it. So why would you use it? So AREDN by nature is designed to support grid down or degraded communication systems. In the US, it's largely used around operation centers, hospitals, emergency response shelters, and things like that, creating those phone links through VoIP, allowing video calls to allow coordination, sharing of documents that might be like a spreadsheet that might take too long over 1200 baud packet or something like that. But there's nothing that stops it operating alongside normal operating infrastructure. So while I talked about a cluster there before of, say, VK1's connection, what happens if we wanted to share a service or some data with our compatriots in Queensland, VK4? There is provision within AREDN to use what they term as tunnels, but are essentially VPN connections or virtual private connections. So where there's no RF connection, they create an internet protocol, an IP connection. I'm currently testing a connection between myself here at my house and 3 locations in Queensland, 2 or 3 in New Zealand, 1 in South Africa, and 1 in Sweden or Denmark. We're using chat server, we're using phone calls. I've installed the software app on my phone, and I connect to AREDN via my Wi-Fi on my phone, and I just use the application as a normal telephone. I had a call with one of the guys, VK4 PUP, the other day. It was pretty cool, just having a normal chat. Excuse me. So that's tunnels. But there are already, as I just said, there are well-established uses such as VoIP, AREDN soft phones. You can bridge normal internet. So I'll cover a little bit more of that later about what we might be able to do here in VK1, what that might look like. But I repeat, if it can operate on IP, generally AREDN can cover it or carry it. There are actually a number of small counties and communities in the US that don't have the budget to set up a full computer-aided dispatch for police, fire, ambulance response. They use an open source, a very mature open source system called OpenCAD or TicketsCAD. And they have their normal network connection, but they know that might go down in an emergency, so they use secondary backhaul. Now there's some super nerdy terms, isn't it? So secondary linking using AREDN and using amateurs within their emergency coordination center to do that IP link back to keep them being able to dispatch services as needed. Okay. So this is me just sort of spitballing some of the thoughts that we could use here, or what are some of the reasons we could use AREDN here in VK1. So, as you know, our big ears repeater, VK1 RGI, which I'll be answering questions on later this evening, it can get snowed in the winter. Or, as we experienced during the summer from hell, fire got pretty close to it. In the US, where the AREDN guys are pretty prevalent, they've actually installed commercial-grade pan, tilt, and zoom, PTZ, cameras on their towers, linking back via AREDN and then using the mesh back to a committee member or just even the community members' houses, and they They might upload a picture every 5 minutes or provide direct access so you can go on and control the camera. They were able to monitor recently in the US a wildfire or bushfire approaching and missing the tower. They were able to, on one of their snowy sites, much like RGI here, they were able to say, oh, we're getting some degraded performance on the 2 metre antenna. Right, I'll spin the camera around, look up the tower. That'd be because it's blown off the tower. That'd explain it. It also, think about some of the events that Wyson support here in the ACT. Bike rides, horse rides, car drives, everything like that. And you might not want to sit a person on a checkpoint all day. It might be cold, it might be hot, it might be we might be having less numbers available to support the event. But you could have an IP camera there that streams that footage back to the event headquarters, and it even as a novelty factor to say, oh look, there's a whole bunch of people passing through the checkpoint now. There's one person who looks like they require assistance, etc. Some of the other uses are a private IP phone network for amateurs. Okay, so let's think about, I talked about the application on my phone before. Let's think about running an event deep south, beyond Tuggeranong, beyond where Telstra reaches. We normally operate on our handhelds, etc. But we have to support, say, a race headquarters. We could beam AREDN hilltop to hilltop and then down into event headquarters. We could set up normal Wi-Fi linking back to AREDN and run a phone server. So, race control can just install the app on their phone we could dial them on a real phone number or extension number, and we can talk to them that way. Oh, okay. Well, that I think that's pretty interesting. Where could you use it? Fixed setups at amateurs' homes generally is the common way, and however, there is the portable setup, and I'll show that in a second. But it's important to also remember that you don't have to be an active user. If you're just interested, or maybe you have a spare PowerPoint in the garage that has good RF lines of sights to other people's properties, you might just want to pop one of those relay nodes up on your house. It only takes a PowerPoint. I'm planning on putting the dish up on my roof and doing a direct connection to another amateur to test that. And I can just run a network cable back down through my roof and pop it into a PowerPoint here and power that up, which I think is pretty cool that the software is all self-contained within the device. So I'll show you a couple of portable setups, my very, very poor meager testing setup, as well as the Stanley. So this is a very well laid out network map of Stanley. Stanley's a Go box that's been built by US amateur there. And just looking at some of the features on your screen, I understand the image quality is not fantastic, but over AREDN, they are supplying, down here, that says free PBX, so that's a free phone server running on a Raspberry Pi, a mesh chat, so a chat room or chat rooms and other such software can be hosted on the Raspberry Pi, which is connected to a mini switch or a mini data point. Additionally, we're going to have a phone, so for VoIP connections. They're also providing an access point for normal Wi-Fi devices. In this case, he's also running a mesh network or an AREDN Wi-Fi connection on 2.4. I'll leave that aside because that's something I've said isn't real good here for Australia. He has the ability to plug his laptop into the mesh. He's running a camera on a pole and another mesh point, or another RF mesh point that he can use to point. So I'm thinking the setup here would be, say, inside a service, inside a building or inside an operation center, and having this pole here on the outside, one looking might be covering the car park or covering the approach or something like that, and this one here providing the link to the wider network. Okay, that looks like it would take up a fair bit of space. So, meet Stanley, as the maker called him, obviously because it comes from a Stanley branded toolbox. Stanley packs away all in these 2 rolly cases. I'm popping some pictures up on the screen now. You can see that the phone sits on top there. There's network points, etc. There's also the ability to power by 240 using a laptop socket, it appears here. And underneath that top layer, there's another switch. There's the Raspberry Pi. There's some, looks like some USB power points. And then the top crate contains all of the hardware. So that's the camera. That's one mesh point. That's another mesh point. Yeah, I thought that was pretty cool. Now you get to see my my very simplistic setup, the one that I was testing with Matt a couple of weeks ago. This is out on a summit after I'd finished playing SOTA. That we call Yellow Rabbit. So it's one summit back from the dam, almost directly in line with Mount McDonald. So you can see my new car there. I'm pretty proud of that one actually. But you can see the little device there on the stick, which is actually my SOTA 7-meter pole. Excuse me. Just held on with some zip ties. And in the bigger picture, you might be able to make out that there's a yellow cable running away there. I'm actually injecting 24 volts up that to power that device and trying to make an RF connection, which in the second shot there you can see I'm looking directly over the top, looking back towards Belconnen. So it's enough sexy pictures, I think. Now let's talk about some of the considerations here in Australia. Our band plan and our licensing structure isn't aligned with the US. The AREDN software is very US centric when it comes down to frequencies and channels. That's largely everything I've covered before, but I wanted to also, the last point is very important there. The frequencies listed are center frequencies. So bandwidth is important when we're figuring out how that affects RF at band edges. So if I flip to 2.4 here in Australia. Okay, the top half here, so above the blue writing, is AREDN's channel plan. The blue channels 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are standard Wi-Fi channels. If you go into your router tonight and check the channels that your 2.4 network has been assigned, it'll largely be one of those numbers. Now, channel 0 cannot be used, and channels -1 and -2 are unlocked by using the AREDN firmware. Now, having a look at that on our band plan, which I've popped directly below there, yeah, you can start to see there's some issues there. So even if we were to try and squeeze -1 into the system there, how does that go with the bandwidth? That's not super cool, because the narrowest bandwidth we can use on AREDN, I believe, is 5 megabits. Sorry, 5 kilohertz, sorry. That's still getting a bit iffy. So, again, we've got a narrow portion there. There would be nothing stopping you running AREDN 2.4 on channels 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. I will flag that. However, you are competing for RF noise with other Wi-Fi devices. If you're running this way down south in the bush, away from everyone's devices, who's to say? It looks like it might be an absolute goer. But I'm talking largely about how we operate within suburban Canberra. So 5.8, I've done the same thing and popped them next to each other, the AREDN channel plan and the Australian license, the Australian band plan. And what did I say before that I suggested? Channel 168, I believe I selected as the best one for here in Canberra. So that would be 5.840. Looking at this here. And you can see these are obviously all Wi-Fi bands or Wi-Fi channels. And here's our band plan. 5, 8, 4, 0. In the middle of the secondary use, which we're all secondary service here, and is covered. So that's why we picked up some of those suggested frequencies and channel listings because of where it fits. Okay, so where can you get some more information? I've covered very broadly tonight, giving you a taste of what AREDN is. The AREDN website, ardenmesh.org, is chock-filled. It's actually one of the best amateur websites I have ever seen. Information's up to date. It's clear. There's detailed how-tos, everything from beginners to advanced. There's lists of devices that the software will support. Forums where you can ask questions on super obscure topics where other like-minded nerds will happily jump in and answer for you. I'm part of a group of people here in Australia trying to start up AREDN in Australia. So they've this week, yesterday I think, started a Facebook group. Hence why the link on your screen is all numbers and not a formal group name yet. And if you're a Facebook person, feel free to jump on there. If you'd like a more detailed look, and it's particularly with a Southern Californian focus where they have 300 nodes on their mesh, Orv, who's a great communicator, Whiskey 6 Bravo India, he has done a 1.5 hour overview, and the YouTube link is there. Coming out on 30 May is the next edition of that video, and that's looking at the device management software. So if you're thinking about becoming an AREDN operator or getting involved, definitely check out ARV's 1.5. I understand it's a lot longer than tonight's session, but you might want to have a bit more of a deep dive and see infrastructure links. So they show a lot of how they've set up many tower sites, but also how they're running them from home. So there's obviously bits and pieces through there for everyone. And that sort of brings me towards the end of my presentation this evening. As I said, there's a number of amateurs in Australia that are trying to kick it off. So we started an email address on Gmail that allows people to have a single point of contact, ardenaustralia@gmail.com, Amateur Radio Emergency Data Network. I have to say it every time when I type the acronym in. So after this evening's stream, I'm going to be available on the 2 meter repeater at Janini, VK1 RGI, which is located on the frequency tone and offset frequency tone and offsets that are currently on your screen. And this presentation will live on our Facebook page and move also to our YouTube page. And when possible, I will reply to any written questions there if you are unable to make the repeater session. So I might kick that out tonight and say thank you for number one, supporting the club during COVID, because as you can imagine, it's a massive steep learning curve for a volunteer organisation to go from kind of starting to record presentations to streaming them to finding content that's interesting and engaging and keeping club members informed. So again, thank you, and I'll catch you on Janini very shortly, and I'll announce when I'm standing by for questions. Once again, my name was Wade, VK1 MIC. You can read some of the crazy projects that I get up to on radio at vk1mic.com. Cheers.